I am from Ghent University, but I'm from the Faculty of Bioscience Engineering. So I am more from the applied side, and I'm a general plant pathologist. And so I was thinking what to present to you people here. And so I have prepared a more general talk about the problems that we face with pathogens. Maybe it's too general for some of you, but anyhow, we will see. And I started from the idea of what is the role of healthy plants in the whole concept of One Health, one of the buzzwords of today. And the One Health concept, I think most of you are familiar. It's a concept that mainly centers on humans and the human diseases. And that actually the concept is that the diseases in humans, you cannot separate them from the animal diseases and the environment in general. And in this concept, people work on the 4 C's: collaboration, communication, coordination, capacity building, and so on. But what you see, what you have in this definition is this unifying approach to optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems based on the 4 C's. Now, but if you look at that concept that was made by medical people and veterinary people, then you see that something that we discussed yesterday is that this is a very strong anthropogenic point of view that these people take, and that the crucial role of plants and plant health in One Health is not really acknowledged. The plants are just part, if you look at the picture of this healthy ecosystem, a few trees that represent the role of the plants in the One Health. And I come back also to what we discussed yesterday. It's a clear sign that this plant blindness and zoochauvinism is also something which is very strong with medical people and with veterinary people. And I think this is something that I would like to, I'm actually the wrong audience because I don't have to convince you, but it is something that is really a problem, that the people who are in medical science and in veterinary science, they don't know anything about plants. Also not for you people, but let's just remind all of us the important role of plants, because they provide so many of the ecosystem services. Maybe it was presented by somebody else, but I just repeat it here. The provisioning, regulating, cultural, supporting. I think most of you are familiar with these issues, but I think this is something that medical people and veterinary people don't realize, that it is plants that provide the food, the plants that provide the feed for the animals, and also all the other functions that you all know about. We also heard yesterday about and today even, the importance of plants for soil and soil microorganisms and so on. Okay. Now, if you look now at the factors that are common in disease risks for plants, animals, and humans, I think there are 3 main factors that they share. And that is the increase in disease risk because of globalization, mainly travel and trade, the climate change that was discussed already a lot, but also that the resistance to antimicrobials and fungicides, I think about the multi-drug resistant bacteria and so on in hospitals, we have actually the very same problem in agriculture, but it just gets much less attention. Another point I think that links plant health with One Health is that plant diseases as such are also a threat for humans and animals. And we have already talked about that today. That is the food security, but also feed security, because you also need to feed your animals. The food safety, I will not talk about that, but this goes in 2 directions. First, the mycotoxins, I think most of you are familiar with that, but also that plants are a reservoir for some human pathogens. Think about salmonella and things like that. Then the pesticides, I want to speak a bit about pesticides later on. And a last point is that it is becoming clear that some plant pathogens can also infect humans. Usually these are humans with a compromised immune system. But for instance, the fungal infections in hospitals are really getting out of control. And a lot of these fungi are just fungi from the environment, and they find a susceptible host in the plant. So this is, I think, also something that links these fields. I just want to talk about 2 aspects a bit more in detail. And I want to start, it has been discussed at length, food security, but now I want to look at food security from a plant pathologist point of view, from the plant health point of view. And then I found this quote in a recent paper that I read, and I think it's a quote from 1928. And it says, "To what will it profit us if all the ills and diseases of the human race be banished, and we then face starvation because of diseases and pests in our foods?" And I think this is a message maybe for our medical doctors, that the basis of everything is still this food security. And so if we think about food security, it has been discussed already at length. We know that our systems are vulnerable. This is also mainly due to the fact that we heavily rely our food on a few important crops. But as a result, we also get global threats on these crops. That means that we get what I would call transboundary pathogens. So we get the same pathogens everywhere on these food crops that we grow everywhere. And I cannot talk for the pests and the weeds, but I know that in these fields, the same things are going on. So because we grow these same crops everywhere, we also spread the same pathogens everywhere. Just to remember, it was beautifully presented yesterday, also about the reliance on the same food crops. And here I just put again the major food crops that people rely on. This is the acreage: maize, rice, wheat, soybean, cassava, and potato. But if you look at the production, because potato produces much more per acre than other crops, then you see this is actually what most people in the world feed on. We don't talk about orphan crops, and this is just what gets attention and where people feed on. And it's also, I think we need to realize that despite talking about agroecology and so on, still 80% of everything that is produced is in monoculture. The result is that we get the same pathogens that spread worldwide. And I just list, maybe it's redundant for you people, but we have, of course, on potato, we have late blight, which is Phytophthora infestans. We have lots of diseases on wheat. The major one is Zymus septoria. I will come back to that a bit later. We have also many rust diseases that spread worldwide on wheat. On rice, we have, of course, blast. And recently, I think it was also mentioned yesterday, that we have a recent jump from blast, Pyricularia, also to wheat. So the wheat blast is also now spreading. On soybean, we have the Asian soybean rust that is spreading worldwide. And cassava, which is more a crop that is grown in Africa, they have to face the viral diseases. Now, just to come back to soybean. So the spread of soybean rust is just an example of what is going on in the field. I could make the same slide for all the other pathogens, but soybean rust, you see the name is Asian soybean rust. That means that the origin of that disease is Asia. You see it was first reported here in 1902, and then it spread. And you see that the introduction in South America is of a very recent date. It only happened in 2001. And then it actually got into the UAE with a hurricane. So that links again to what we talked yesterday, climate change. And so it was actually Hurricane Ivan who carried the spores of the pathogen in the US in 2004. And you see here how it happened. Now, but what have been the consequences in terms of protection? And this is what I want to show you on this slide. So when you go to the situation in Brazil, and you look at the pesticide sales in Brazil, you see here, doesn't work very well, the point. So you see the pesticide sales. So you see that 56% of all the fungicides go to soybean. And these fungicides, they are actually only used to control this new disease on soybean that has been introduced in 2001. So that means that they now have to apply massive amounts of fungicides to keep this pathogen under control. And that is because if they don't do that, they have yield loss up to 80%. And this is what is going on. And so if you look at the control costs, people have calculated that what it costs just to keep this introduced pathogen on soybean under control, then you see the figure, and it's quite impressive. So that is the situation. And so this is what happens on our food crops. And what we see is that we get really massive problems with what I call the invasive and emergent pathogens. And if you look at these pathogens, you have invasive ones that spread. But we also have new pathogens. I will say a few words about that. We have also evolution of existing pathogens, and we have re-emergence of pathogens. And all these pathogens, either invasive or emerging, they spread very rapidly. And this is due to the globalization. And it's mainly due to trade, but also to increased travel. And we see that many of these pathogens travel around the world on the seeds and the planting material. So there's where the problem starts. And then there are legal procedures in place, the quarantine measurements and so on. But these procedures are inadequate, especially if we deal with new pathogens. Because if we have a new pathogen, they're not part of the legislation and they cannot control them because they are new. And even if the pathogens that we know very well, the procedures are leaky, it's very, very difficult to stop the trade, to control everything that is transported. And that is actually a big, big problem that we have. And if you look then at the drivers of the emerging pathogens and the new pathogens, usually it boils down to a change in the biogeography of either the host or the pathogen. And the major driver is what we call pathogen pollution. It's the human movement of pathogens outside of their natural geographic area or host range. And that is usually by trade, seeds and planting material. But we also have examples where pathogens meet new vectors. Other pathogens like the rusts, they just naturally disperse by winds and so on. We have climate change, but that has already been discussed. And of course, also our agricultural practices, they are really drivers of emerging and re-emerging pathogens. And I just want to show a few slides that all these issues do not only affect our crops, they also affect many other ecosystems. And I think here in France, a lot of scientists are actively working on the invasive pathogens on trees. And if you look at the invasive pathogens on trees, then what you see is, of course, we know the historical problems. That is the Dutch elm disease. It's in any course on plant pathology. Actually, the Dutch elm disease that destroyed almost all elm trees in Europe. It's a pathogen that is originally coming from Japan and was actually, we had two epidemics, one in 1910 and one in 1970. But if we go look more recently, we have this disease on ash dieback. It's a pathogen, it's called Hymenoscyphus fraxineus or Calara fraxineus, some people call it. That is a pathogen that has its origin in Japan. It was known in East Europe and people have just seen the spread. 2010 introduction in Europe, people in the UK saw the pathogen and they were just waiting for it to cross the sea, and they have major problems there now. And it really destroys a large majority of our ash trees, this ash dieback. Other problems on the horse chestnut. We have a bleeding disease. It's a bacterial disease. The causal agent is a Pseudomonas, and the origin of that pathogen is in India. And that appeared out of the blue in 2001 at several countries at the same time. And of course, the final disaster is the introduction of Xylella fastidiosa. I think lots of people are familiar with that. It started in Italy. You know everything about it. Olive big decline. And there it's actually a very unfortunate introduction from Ecuador on coffee plants that were showing no symptoms. But what happened is that the Xylella, which is a xylem pathogen, found in Italy a new vector. Because this is a pathogen that is introduced in the xylem of the olive tree by insects. And it was just this unhappy combination between the introduction of the Xylella plus the new vector that was encountered in Europe that caused the big disasters on the olive trees. And you see that all these issues have happened really very recently. But it's not only in the trees. We also have emerging pathogens in horticulture, which is one of the fields I'm active in. And what we have in horticulture is also lots of new diseases. And I just point out two recent viral diseases that we have problems with in Belgium and the Netherlands, probably also in France. So the first one is called this, it's both on tomato, the tomato brown rugosa fruit virus. It's a virus that was first seen in Israel in 2014. Then it spread to Jordan in 2015, and now it's rapidly spreading in the whole of Europe. Not very clear where it came from. The other viral disease on tomato is pepino mosaic virus. That is better understood. It is a virus that comes originally from South America. There it was a pathogen on pepino. That's why it is called pepino mosaic virus, which is like a melon-like fruit. And there, apparently there a host jump has occurred to tomato. It was introduced in Europe in 1999 and has then spread throughout the horticultural area in Europe. Another pathogen that we actively work on in the lab is Fusarium wilt. So Fusarium wilt on lettuce. It's an oxysporum, so it's a pathogen that also attacks the xylem. And here we know also very well the history. So we have in this pathogen different races. That means races that attack different cultivars of tomato. And we know that the first race was race 1, was originally from Japan. The first description is 1967. And then this pathogen has been introduced in Italy in 2001, but was really a pathogen on lettuce in Southern Europe, because it was a pathogen that was a bit more adapted to a warmer region. But what happened is that in Belgium and in the Netherlands, and then later on also in the north of France, in 2015, a new race of Fusarium wilt of lettuce appeared. We call it race 4. And this race 4 has really wiped out the lettuce production in Belgium, because people in Belgium still do a lot of lettuce production in soil. And it seems that this pathogen is better adapted to the cooler cultural conditions in Northern Europe. So it has been spreading in Belgium, it has been spreading in the Netherlands, and there is really no way you can control these pathogens. And then the seed companies in the Netherlands have been working very hard to make resistant varieties against race 4. And so they introduced their first resistant varieties, I think it was in 2019. And we have discovered already a race, we call it at this moment race 4+, that has already broken through the resistance that the lettuce breeders have introduced into the varieties just 1 year before. So it shows the tremendous capacity of these pathogens to adapt. Because what happens, a new resistant variety, everybody wants to use it, you get the pressure on the pathogen, and then this is what is happening. Okay, I think you're all familiar with that. And so if you look at the evolutionary mechanisms by which plants pathogens emerge, so there are several evolutionary mechanisms. So the first one is what we call host tracking. So that means that the pathogens co-evolve and co-domesticate with the host. This is, for instance, what has happened with Zimoseptoria tritici. It's a co-domesticated pathogen, also Pyricularia oryzae. So these are co-domesticated pathogens. But we also have host range expansion. So that means that some pathogens have the ability to affect a novel host instead of the host of origin. Okay, so that's what we maybe see in the tomatoes. But you also have host shifts, that they adapt to a new host, but also host jumps, so that they go to a completely genetic distant host. But what is interesting is that new pathogens can also appear by 2 other mechanisms, which is horizontal gene transfer of pathogenicity functions and by hybridization. And if you look at the genetic mechanisms that lead to new pathogens and also invasiveness of some pathogens, I think it's the classical mechanisms that you know from genetics. It's mutation, but also horizontal gene transfer. And this is something that we now start to realize, that also a lot of horizontal gene transfer is taking place between fungi. And this way you can also create new pathogens. Hybridization, is also a major cause of the occurrence of new pathogens. I will show an example in a minute, and also, of course, sexual recombination. But it needs to be clear that you don't need sexual recombination to get evolution in pathogens. Evolution in pathogens can also happen by mutation, that can be by transposon jumps, things like that. That is also very important to remember. Now, there are actually quite a few examples of hybridization. So that means that new pathogens occur by hybridization between known pathogens. And one of the pathogens we also used to work on a lot in the lab is Verticillium. And we have actually the classical Verticillium dahlia, which is a wilt pathogen on more than 400 plant species. But actually in the 70s, a new Verticillium species has occurred, and we call that Verticillium longisporum. And Verticillium longisporum is really adapted to cabbages, to Brassicacea. And it has been found that actually Verticillium longisporum is a diploid. So Verticillium dahlia is a haploid fungus, and Verticillium longisporum is a diploid. That's why we call it longisporum. Also, the spores are longer than the classical ones. And the parents are Verticillium dahlia plus an unknown ancestor. And somehow hybridization has taken place. And then a new pathogen has occurred that is much better adapted to cabbages than the dahlia, which is not that pathogenic on cabbage. So that is one example that we see in the vegetables. The other example is a classical example that some of you may know. It's the occurrence of Phytophthora alni on the aldus trees, the alder trees. And that happened in 1993. And that is a complicated business because actually this is a hybrid between 3 different Phytophthora species. It's actually a triploid Phytophthora. And the parents of that, the original parent is probably Phytophthora cambivora and then a few others. And the interesting thing is that the original parents do not attack alder, but it's the hybrid that has changed hosts. So this is something that also goes on. This is actually by hybridization, you get new pathogens that can attack new hosts. And horizontal gene transfer, there are also various examples, and this is a classical one. It's the occurrence of a new pathogen on cereals, and it is a pathogen. They have changed names quite a lot, these pathogens, but this is what we call gloom blotch on the cereals. It's called by, nowadays we should call this pathogen Phaeosphaeria nodorum. And actually this is a pathogen that makes a host selective toxin, TOX-A, that is recognized by a specific intracellular receptor inside susceptible cultivars. And actually the gene coding for TOX-A has been transferred to another fungal strain, and it has turned into a new pathogen, which is now called Pyrenophora triticirripentis, and that has created a new disease that we call tan spot. And people have shown that one of the reasons that this disease occurs is because the fungus got actually that toxin gene cluster from the other one. Okay, so this evolution in agroecosystems, of course, is very well known because it's the ideal place for evolution, because you have these very large populations, you get increase in genetic diversity either by recombination or mutation. And what you then see in our agriculture populations is that they become resistant against the fungicides, or they break through the genetic resistance, that especially if it is monogenic resistance. But you also create there these chances for hybridization and horizontal gene transfer because you just have these massive populations. And I just want to say a few words. Okay, so we have all these new pathogens. I already tried to explain to you that some of them just need to be controlled, and that sometimes the only way to do that is with pesticides. And then it's interesting, I think, to look at the pesticide use in the world. And so what I did is I took the data. So it's not so easy to find data on pesticides, but you can find data on pesticide sales. You can find them in the FAO database. And what you see here is the total pesticide sales expressed in 1,000 tons in the different parts of the world. So you have Europe, sits here. Here is Europe. Then North America is in blue. You have South America, it's here in green. You have Asia, and you see Africa. So that is the total pesticide sales. But then it's interesting if you zoom on what kind of pesticides are used. And I try to point that out here in the figure below. And what you see in blue are the insecticides, in orange, the fungicides, and then in green, the herbicides. Now, if you look at the North American market, you see that the North American market is a herbicide market. It's almost completely dominated by herbicides. If you look at the insecticides, most insecticides are used in Asia. And if you look in South America, it's still a lot of herbicides, but also already some fungicides and insecticides are used. But then if we zoom in, so Africa is a bit equally distributed, but if we zoom in on Europe, you see that Europe has a very strong fungicide market. And so we use actually much more fungicides in Europe than, for instance, in the US. And why is that? Is first, we have a very intensive agriculture, especially in Northwest Europe, but we also have a climate that is conducive to fungal diseases, especially all the areas close to the sea, they have a conducive climate for fungal diseases. And the pesticide use, if you look per country, of course, France is number one, but there's also an agriculture number one. So I think it's not a surprise that most of the pesticides, despite all your zero pesticide plans, still it's major sales of pesticides are still in France. And you can just see these are also the places in the world where, in Europe, where most agriculture is done. Okay. Now, if you look at pesticides, you can ask you the question, why do farmers use them? And I think it's a question that we really need to address. And that is, of course, to assure this food security, to ensure food safety, what we just discussed before. But also pesticides are very easy to use and they are cheap. And in some crops, we have also a large return on investment if we use these pesticides. And people usually focus on the left part of the column with all the problems, the environmental issues and the toxicity and so on. But that actually the real problems that we have now is resistance development, which is becoming a major issue. I'll show you a figure in a minute. But also that we lose a lot of these products. There is no renewal of some active substances. And there's also hardly any new chemistry in the pipeline. So this is actually the situation here. Two things I would like to say a few words about. That is why farmers use it, and also the resistant development. And I think some of you know the example. I want to give it anyhow for those of you who are not familiar. And the best example to show why farmers use pesticides is the example of Zymus septoria on wheat. Because if you don't control it, it depends on your weather, but if you don't control it, you have about 50% yield losses. And we know that about 70% of all the fungicides that are used on cereals in Europe are used to control Zymus septoria. But it gives the farmer a huge return on investment because it gives you a yield boost on average of 2.5 tons per hectare. The spraying cost depends a bit with what you spray and how often. You can say, okay, conservative guess, €100 per hectare. And then you have to know, I think most of you know, but that you here in France grow 5 million hectares of wheat. And if you control Zymus septoria triticale, you have an added value of 2,400 million euros per year. And this is just reality. So it gives you this enormous boost. Another interesting figure for the French people is, okay, the pesticide intensity on the different crops. And I think it's also an interesting figure. I just got it from some website. So what you see is the average number of treatments. And you see the division between herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. And now I just want to focus on the fungicides. So on which crops do we use all these fungicides? And then you see it's grapevine, it's apple, and it's potato. So this is intensity, the number of sprays. But then I think you need to realize, why do the farmers need to spray so often? And that is because of three major diseases. On grapevine, it's the downy mildew, the Plasmopara viticola. On potato, obviously, is the Phytophthora infestans. And on the apple, it's apple scab, Venturiae inequalis. And so this is actually the reason why on these three crops, we have all these sprays. So for instance, if you look at some, in wheat, we also spray against Zimoseptoria, but you don't spray 10 times a season. If you're lucky, 2 sprays are enough. Okay, now, what is interesting is to look at the fungicide resistance. So what happens? So, you know, we have these pathogens that we need to control. We have Zimoseptoria, we have the pathogens that get sprays multiple times. And so I recently did an analysis of the fungicide resistant reports only in Northwest Europe. So I don't speak about South Europe, Northwest Europe. And one of the interesting sources to get this type of information is from the EPO database about fungicide resistance, where you people here in Paris have been very actively, Anne-Sophie Walker has been very active. And so what you see is, so what you, how I did it. So you see a number. So that means there are 27 different cases in the database of resistance occurrence Zimoseptoria. And the number between brackets is the number of the modes of actions. So the different modes of actions. And you can immediately see who's on the top. Number 1, fungicide resistant problem fungus in Europe is Zimoseptoria triticale. So the most cases, reported cases of fungicide resistance is on Zimoseptoria. But if you look at the list, you can also see the others. You see number 3 is Plasmopara viticola. Okay, it's number 3 because it's the situation in Northwest Europe. If you introduce the southern countries, it will probably move to number 1. So Plasmopara viticola is there. You see Venturiae inequalis is also there, fungicide resistance. But another interesting example, maybe for you, Mathilde, is that Botrytis cinerea, especially Botrytis cinerea and strawberry, is actually in Northwest Europe number 4 in terms of fungicide resistant problems, because they get resistance, you see, to 6 different modes of actions. Some strains have this multiple resistance against 6 different modes of actions. It's really a multi-drug resistant fungus in these crops. And I think this gives us the picture of what is going on in that field. And so what I think that because the way we do our agriculture, we have created what I call agricultural superbugs. And these superbugs, they are usually leaf pathogens, which have similar life cycles. They are polycyclic. They have several cycles per season. They have a high genomic plasticity. They can reach high population sizes and high genetic diversity. And we usually need multiple fungicide applications on the susceptible varieties. And these are the ones that have this high risk for resistance development. And these are also the bugs that are extremely difficult to control in organic agriculture. And people rely very heavily on copper. And so I think this is something that also people need to realize, that we have the enemy that we need to control in traditional agriculture. It's really amazing. They really got out of control. And then finally, okay, you know, we have done these ideas. We need to transition to plant health. And then this is usually depicted as such, that we started by controlling our pathogens by the chemical crop protection, killing. Then if we move to integrated pest management, okay, let's try to reduce the pests and pathogens to a certain level. And then the new concept, very strong here in France, is the agroecological crop protection, where we have to strengthen the plant. But the question is how to get there with the situation that we have. And then you have these people who make this transition. I think you people here in France are also very active in this field. That is, okay, how do you do this transition towards what we call sustainable intensification? So the idea is to increase the performance without actually a net environmental costs. And then there is one, I think is a seminal paper that was published a few years ago, that people start to follow now, is that you have actually 3 different steps how to get there. First, okay, we have the existing situation. Okay, let's make this existing situation more efficient. Use precision farming, decision support systems, and so on. The second part is substitution. And this is where you people are all active in that field, because we need to replace these fungicides. Even if you're not against fungicides, they will just lose their activity. And that means we need other technologies. We need the crop, we need the breeders, but we also need biopesticides, we need the defense stimulators, we need RNAi, anything out of the toolbox is needed. And then finally, and that will be the biggest problem, is how to design your agro ecosystem. How can you diversify to strengthen resilience? This is where you finally have to get, but it's a long way until we are there, I think. So I have a few take-home messages, my last slides. Okay, I think the only way to keep feeding the people, I think we are just too many people. I think it's also something that we should realize, but they are there and we have to feed them. The only way to do this is to what we call the sustainable intensification. We are having an agricultural system that you all know, limited number of crops, low genetic diversity, and this makes the system very susceptible to pathogens, weeds and pests. And we get this occurrence of new or aggressive pathogens, and we should realize that they can emerge suddenly, as I tried to explain to you, and then they disperse worldwide and are very difficult to control. And so the pesticides, they guarantee the higher yields in vulnerable crops, but this is also coming to an end because of this resistant development and very few new products in the pipelines. And I think we need to make this shift to plant health, but in the meantime, we have to deal with these aggressive pathogens, weeds and pests, comparable with the superbugs in medicine. And I think we can only keep them under control with a diversified toolbox of solutions. We should not be dogmatic, but just use anything that we can have to control it. That's my message. So.